All right, Scott, welcome to episode 29.
29 feels like a big number, Mark.
We're just about to turn 30, aren't we?
Yeah. Well,
Uh,
it's just exciting.
it is. And today we have two great guests who actually are the first time we're having guests that come back from the previous year. But the topic is so important. It comes up on almost every single podcast we have. And that is that the specialty drug benefit design and how that sort of dictates a lot of the challenges that we have related to access.
Yeah, absolutely. It's foundational, obviously. And moreover, it is, part of the chain that is so beleaguered and challenging for doctors and patients.
Well, we're thrilled to have. So welcome. We have Morgan Lee, who's the PhD, Senior Director, Research and Strategy, and Renee Rayberg, who's a pharmacist and Vice President, Clinical Strategy for PSG. And thank you both for joining us today.
Thanks for having us.
Well, great. I'll give you a big softball question to begin with, right? Which is that, and as it's one of the things where I'm actually really proud I did my homework beforehand. So, but before we dive into the detail of the reports, which again is fantastic, can you share a little bit about PSG and about how you guys came to develop this trend report and seem to be doing it every year? Give us a little bit of background on that.
Yeah, I'm happy to take that one. So PSG is a pharmacy benefits consulting company. We help payers, employers, and health plans really create the very best strategies to optimize their drug benefits. PSG has been around for decades, and we've actually had an amazing program of independent research for over a decade as well. We have 4 major annual reports. This is the first one that comes out every year. And this is actually, I believe, our 12th year of doing this report. So we've been doing this one for a really long time. We're very proud of it. We're very grateful. We have a co-sponsor on this report. Genentech works with us, and they've been a partner for a number of years now as well. And yes, we're excited to continue bringing these independent insights to the market and hope to do so for another decade or two.
And what kind of audiences do you interact with here? Who all is responding to the question?
So our survey respondents are employers, unions, and health plans. And we're talking to the folks who are making decisions about or managing the drug benefit.
And so help us, how did you decide what to track year over year? Because I noticed this year in the 25 report, there are things that weren't in the 24 report. So help us understand how you sort of just make those decisions to track what you track.
That's a great question. We've been doing it for a long time. We have some questions that we're asking every single year, and then we have other questions that are kind of coming and going from one year to the next. So we look at a number of different things. One is some of these items are really useful for benchmarking. So we're trying to make sure we're getting them in there every year or at least every other year. Some of them we're continuing to see changes, so we want to keep that in year over year to be able to track those changes. And then some things are these new topics that are really coming up, and maybe they'll be a major topic of discussion for a few years. They might sort of fall out of favor, and so maybe we'll kind of replace them with something else. So there's a lot that goes into it. It's painful decisions every year to decide what isn't going to make the cut. I would just have a 200-question survey if I could, but I don't think anyone would want to answer that. So hard decisions, but we do it all right.
Yeah, I can imagine. And what kind of response do you get in the current format?
We feel really positive about our response rate. So this report had a little over 230 respondents. When you think about these needing to be people who are decision makers at these employer and health plan organizations, we're really excited about that. We're always continuing to work to make sure we have a really robust sample so that our results can be reliable.
Yeah, awesome. Well, Mark, why don't we start digging in a little bit, and why don't we start with sort of the cost concerns to begin with. They seem to be foundational, obviously, for so many of the stakeholders, particularly the kinds that you mentioned, Morgan, and drive a lot of their decision-making and thinking about the remainder of it, I expect. What did you find in the area of cost trends and concerns about cost trends?
Yeah. So the biggest thing that I would say there is looking at goals around specialty drug management. So for a long time, it's been true that the top 2 goals, if we're asking folks to rank goals, is managing their specialty trend and managing their total cost of care. And that's probably not surprising to anyone, but I think surprising is that it's continuing to increase. So last year, 75% of our respondents gave one of those two as their very top answer. This year, that was 84%. So almost a 10% increase year over year, even when we're getting what we would call in research a ceiling effect, right? Almost everyone is already headed that direction, but there was still more room to focus more heavily on cost and cost containment. So I think that shows they're really feeling the urgency around the need to manage costs.
Can I follow up on that just a moment? I assume that like managing the overall cost of care, Morgan, that feels like it's inclusive of the drug, but would include, other aspects as well. I've sometimes wondered, which is consistent with, sort of my interactions with employers and plan sponsors and all that sort of thing as well. And I've wondered, kind of whether or not the pain is so acute, let's say for employer groups, for example, that it almost, the drugs are a part of it. And what I've wondered is like, well, what if we could actually solve like the fair drug pricing, conundrum or whatever, and everyone could feel satisfied that, oh, these medicines are great and they're, fairly priced and all that sort of thing. I've wondered like, yeah, but maybe it might be that even so, the pain of like healthcare costs generally just going up year over year, driving, say, another 6 or 8% premium increase, would have the employers still saying to their PBM and their payer, I need more savings. I don't care where you get it, just go get it, And so is there a path for, the drug component? I know it's very hypothetical, but could it ever find peace caught in this broader context of overall care costs?
I want to have Renee speak to that one.
So one, I think it's super important, but there's just this focus on cost only, right? So trying to get the best unit cost. And I think that, and I agree, and it's still like a number one. But when you look at it, utilization matters. So years ago, I won an affordability challenge when I worked for a large organization. It was a health plan organization. And I was meeting with their CFO. The CFO said, specialty drugs, the problem, they're just too expensive. If we could just lower the price of the specialty drugs. But what we forget about is the utilization, right? So it really doesn't matter how expensive a drug is if no one is using it. But what does matter is utilization. And at Assembia last week, we learned that Doug Long had a presentation, was great. And so he was talking about the total drug sales for 2024. And I think it was like 78% of the sales were driven by volume. So it's the volume of the drugs, right? So again, so when we look at the survey, we did see that, reducing inappropriate utilization, although, wasn't ranked as a number one goal, almost half the respondents ranked it as number 2 or number 3. So, and we feel very strongly that you have to couple it together, right? You have to manage both cost and utilization. So I agree. We need to head to better, pricing on drugs overall. But then we also have to look at the appropriate use of the drugs and managing the utilization, mitigate waste, things like that.
Well, I'm thinking even beyond that. That's great to hear, understand, Renee. But I'm thinking even beyond that, like, if I'm an employer and my, healthcare premium is going to go up 6 or 8%, even if it's being driven, and I'm making it up, but even if it's being driven, let's say, primarily by doctors and hospitals, I think I'm still going to tell my broker and my plan, go find the savings wherever you can.
It's true. And I think that we have the ability, when we work with clients, we are always looking at their data so we can identify those outlier costs. But there's an interest in the market today to say, hey, are some of these newer drugs coming in the market that are costing billions of dollars, or some that are approved maybe through accelerated approval, are these must cover drugs? Like, we actually get those questions from clients today. So I think, that payers are interested in, right? They want to be able to provide access to their drugs, but they also want to be able to provide, access to healthcare, right, over time.
Like there was an increase in the report in, especially for health plans, that increased for specialty drug carve-out programs. Is that one of the strategies that people are using more and more to mitigate some of these increasing costs? And if so, could you first of all explain what is a specialty drug carve-out program?
I can have Renee explain what it is, but I will say about that in our data this year, we saw a slight difference year over year. We're really cautious when we see it happening in only one of our respondent groups, and it's still a pretty low number. So with specialty drug carve-out, I think we want to see it for another year before we say much about whether that's really a trend.
So especially drug carve out would be seeking a different vendor. Like today, you have one PBM, one vendor that's managing your drugs across specialty mail, everything. So carve out would be seeking a separate vendor to do maybe specialty or, to do specialty and mail and then have a different PBM. We are seeing interest in the industry to look for a change or look for something different. The current solution it just doesn't seem to be working for everyone. And so this one size fits all, may not be the right solution. So I think the interest is in looking for like a more targeted approach that is customized to address the need. So matching the right solution to what they need. It's challenging and it's difficult, and you have to have the resources internally to be able to manage multiple vendors if you would go this route. So we're not saying everybody do it, but there's interest. So I think to Morgan's point, I don't know that it's a trend yet, but like I think we're going to keep looking at it and see, how does this fare, or is it going to change how the current vendors do business to try to maybe create an environment where they're not looking for a different vendor and looking for a change.
Well, and I'll just add one other piece. So in an upcoming report, we talk a lot about an actual unbundled approach to PBM services, which would be pulling out specialty, but also pulling out other components. And to Renee's point, not seeing a whole lot of individual organizations actually doing this yet, but we are seeing a lot of interest. And so there's starting to be some movement in that space. And check out that report for a lot more on that topic if you're interested.
How about from the patient perspective? Can you comment on changes in patient cost sharing?
So in terms of measuring actual cost sharing, this report doesn't cover that. Our next report actually has a lot on kind of cost sharing dollar amounts. What we did see here, though, was in terms of challenges, affordability of cost sharing amounts for members rose to the top as being one of the highest rated challenges among both employers and health plans. So really seeing that coming to the forefront as a concern. Obviously, there are lots of different ways to handle that, but we're definitely seeing a lot of concern there. I will just give you a sneak peek into our next report. We're not seeing a whole lot of changes, for example, across the first few tiers of drugs and what a copay or coinsurance is looking like right now. But we are seeing payers really thinking about making more changes to their cost sharing arrangements.
And how about in the tiering itself then, Morgan? Are there changes and strategies around how many tiers and where I put non-preferred specialty products and that kind of thing?
So at a really high level, we're not seeing a lot of changes at this time. But Renee, I'd be curious from your perspective on that one. Are you seeing and talking with clients about any changes, any common strategies there?
Yeah, so not a lot either, because I think that the programs that are out there, like the copay maximizers and things, kind of interfere with really the function that tiering can have, right? So I think it's more using whatever resources you have, such as those programs, if it works for your organization, to try to get savings, for the plan, but for the member as well. So most of the ones I work with most clients have some kind of copay assistance program in place. So it takes the specialty drug copays down, even if they're in high deductible or cost sharing, it takes it down to, either $0, $5, or $10. So that doesn't give you a lot of functionality with, a preferred or non-preferred. So in some cases, we're seeing where it's not non-preferred anymore. It's just that the drug is not covered, So like if you look at some of the categories like inflammatory conditions, I mean, some PBMs, might cover Taltz and not Cosentyx and things like that. I think we're seeing more of a move towards that. But right now, those programs are in full use and being, savings are happening for members too. So not sure if that will continue, but, no one has the answer to that question.
On the copay accumulators and copay maximizers, those are, in some states, they're outlawed, right? So, I mean, like, how are your plans sort of dealing with the negative effects of these and the negative effects on patients as well? Are they taking steps to what steps can they take to mitigate some of the negative impacts of that strategy?
Yeah, so they're really relying on their vendors. And so some of the ways that the programs are set up, they're able to get around some, I think, of the regulations or whatever, but it's really a reliance on the vendors and setting up the program in a way that that it is beneficial to the members. So most of the groups I work with are in, areas where they're able to do some of it. And so they have it set up where they're like they classify the drugs as non-essential, things like that. And they're able to take advantage of it. I think when they start having to make decisions, these benefit design decisions are very difficult because, if those programs weren't going to be available and you have to go back to cost sharing, then you run the risk of the affordability challenges for patients as well. So trying to figure out, what share of the costs can, they maintain and, what is reasonable for members. But most right now are still in these programs, and then programs are managed by the PBMs who have, it's essentially a PBM, but they have vendors that they deal with, to manage the program. So right now, like it's functioning, but again, changes are going to happen each year. So, but they rely on, the PBMs to bring that information.
One item that comes up sometimes with some of our guests in thinking about things that might help, I'll say, is value-based contracts, value-based arrangements, outcomes-based contracts, those kinds of things. What's your perspective on those things? And was there, I know there was some information last year in the report, but there didn't seem to be as much this year.
Yeah, it's a great question. And we believe it's a really important topic, and we continue to hear a lot of conversation about it. Renee mentioned we were at Asembia last week. I think there was a whole session that was focused on it, and there's a lot of importance there. What we had found, though, for a number of years running was very, very low uptake of value-based agreements. Not very many people actually using them. So we decided for this year to actually remove those questions. We had some other really burning topics we wanted to put in there. We have every intention of bringing them back. We continue to believe it's an important topic, but because we weren't really seeing that actual use of this strategy yet, we decided to push pause on it in the survey for a year. But Renee, is there anything else about value-based agreements that you would add just based on your consulting experience?
Yeah. So a couple of things. One, they can be difficult, to execute. And so, in terms of identifying what data points, collecting that data and agreeing upon the data and the sources and all of that, who's going to manage it. Oftentimes, I think we see a little bit more of it being managed by the medical benefit, the health plans that manage that are the vendors and such. Right. But I think the interest was stronger last year because of cell and gene therapies, because a lot of those manufacturers were, bringing these value-based contracts to the market, especially for the chronic condition ones like hemophilia drugs, stuff like that. Mm-hmm. And since we've seen, a slower than expected uptake of these cell and gene therapies, it just isn't, something that we're dealing with a ton right now. It's not a super top priority. I think there's a big benefit to it if you can, agree and get all the data collected and all of that. But, I think there's definitely a benefit for companies standing behind their drugs and, the proposed benefit that the drugs should have. It just it's a challenge.
Well, I guess while there's low uptake there, I guess the highest uptake was the issue of rebates, right?
Everyone loves that, Mark.
Yeah, I was going to say, let's turn to the much more high utilized, much more favored. On the rebate side, we noticed that between 24 and 25, obviously it's already so high, so there's not much change. But one of the big changes we did see was the 13% increase for health plans in getting rebates out of the medical benefit. So it seems like that seems to be you guys tell me whether that's a trend or not, but for us that stood out. So could you tell us a little bit more about rebates and especially around the medical benefit rebates?
Absolutely. So I'll jump in first and just talk a little bit about the survey data. So yeah, we're seeing this year about 3/4 of health plans indicating that they're getting rebates under the medical benefit. That's still much lower for employers. It was about 35%. And we had seen a small increase, I think it was last year compared to the year prior, in employers receiving medical rebates. This year had kind of stagnated, seeing about the same results as what we had last year. And then as you kind of alluded to, everyone getting rebates under the pharmacy benefit. We did also find that about 2/3 of those who were getting pharmacy rebates had seen an increase in rebate dollars in the past few years. And that was, I think, a little over half under the medical benefit. This year, we really, though, dug a little bit more into those medical drug rebates, and we asked if they were making this a priority. So if you're already getting these rebates, is maximizing those rebates a priority for you? We saw that particularly among health plans, it really was a priority, trying to figure out how to maximize those rebate dollars. And then we asked a little bit about strategies that they were using in that area. There's a wide variety of strategies there, even including trying to mirror some of the strategies that they use on the pharmacy side. So lots of interesting data this year. We know that medical drug rebates had become sort of more of a focus for some plans, so we dug in there.
There also, at the same time, there also seemed to be a hint in some of the respondents that there might be sponsors, plan sponsors out there that understand the rebates can be distorting as well, and that they were thinking about net costs and other alternative approaches to thinking about the rebates. Any insights on that? And Renee, including from your not only the report, but your consulting work with clients.
Why don't I share a little bit about the data, and then yes, Renee, please jump in because I know you have a lot of experience with this with clients on this. So we've been asking about alternatives to rebates in this report for at least a few years now. But this year we kind of beefed up those questions. So we've been asking, how interested are you in some different alternatives, like choosing drugs that are a lower cost but don't offer rebates, or passing rebates on to members at the point of sale.
Yeah.
And we found at least moderate interest in most of the alternatives. I won't go through every single one of them here today, but feel free to look in the report for more. But what we also asked was, has your interest changed? Are you feeling more interested in these alternatives over time, as you're seeing some of the pain that can come around rebates? And we did see a chunk of our respondents, about a quarter to a third of them, indicating that they were having increased interest in these alternatives. And then lastly, that was new for this year, and I love to highlight this, we asked, are you actually implementing a strategy? So if you said, yep, I'm really interested in this idea of preferring these lower cost drugs that don't have rebates, are you doing anything about that? And I actually find the results encouraging. We found it was around 1 in 4 of those who were really interested in any given alternative actually implementing strategies to try to get there. And it's still small percentages overall, but it is showing some real movement in that space.
Is one of those related also to the biosimilar, whether biosimilars are being adopted, and does that change how people look at rebates? And help us understand that as well.
That's exactly where I was going to go, actually. So the rebates are a huge source of savings, right? And so from a spreadsheet perspective, it's a big dollar amount. And when you think about drugs like Humira, that was a top rebate contributor. So it is a challenge, right, for those that are managing the benefits to then answer to their senior leadership when that number is going to be reduced. So you have to be able to find a way to share the reporting of where the savings is coming from. But what happened with the biosimilars is, with Humira, several of them entered with a high WAC and a low WAC. And I think employers or payers, not just employers, but they got a taste of, wow, we can either pay more money at the point of sale, right? And then wait 6 or 9 months for, the rebates to come in and then, reconcile with the rebates to get our savings. Or we could just pay a lower amount up front, and actually could be better for members as well, if they aren't in copay programs or whatever, because then the members would have lower pressures and things like that. So that's where it got interesting. And so I think that biosimilars definitely had some effect on this. And then it's really interesting because as Stelara is coming to the market, I'm pretty sure only the first Stelara biosimilar has a high WAC and a low WAC. And we heard both at Assembia and then the conference I'm at this week that they're not entering, most are just entering the market at a low WAC. So I think there's more interest in getting this lower net cost. Now, it doesn't solve the problem of, I think, when you spreadsheet it, you're looking for a replacement for the rebates that are going to be missing, right? So but there isn't the same way to, you're not getting a check that says, here's your amount of money as you are for rebates. So it really has to change the process in the way that you're, accounting for the financials and really realizing the savings. I mean, these biosimilars, there's a ton of competition, even at a conference I was at 2 weeks ago, one of the biosimilar manufacturers, approached me and said, would employers be interested if we were able to bring the cost of a biosimilar down to, a few $100s for Humira? I mean, that cost is so much lower and would be so much more of a savings than probably what they're collecting in the rebates, right? But it's like, how do you reconcile all of it to be able to prove that? So there is a movement towards this lowest net cost, but you have to have the right data infrastructure. You have to have the right, access to the data and the reporting. And we're not talking about it today, but one of the challenges, I think it was number 3 or something, right, was access to integrating data, right? So like that's a challenge. So it's a lot, but I think we're moving more towards that. There's definitely more interest in lowest net cost and getting that savings up front.
Can I turn a little bit to the medical benefit side of things now for the, provider administered drugs? There always seems to be high interest in, being able to operate formularies there, get rebates and those kinds of things. And yet we understand that with ASP-based reimbursement, that it's difficult, structurally for the manufacturers to provide rebates there. Insights in that arena, what's going on the medical benefit?
So I think that there, again, is interest in trying to understand really what reimbursements are and that type of thing. And I think that there is some movement towards preferred products now, because there's so much competition in some of the, most commonly used categories that do have rebates. And then some of the biosimilar companies are offering rebates as well. So we are seeing that. But in the ASP environment, it's tricky because there's more margin for doctors, right, to bill for, a drug that costs more. So there has to be attention paid to that as well. And that's not something that we address in the, in the survey itself. But you have to like accommodate for that in other ways, right? And so I think there's incentives that some of those that are managing the medical benefits are working with providers, maybe incentives, to get them to use some of the lower cost drugs and maybe, higher administration costs, things like that. But it's a process. And at the end of the day, there has to be kind of, skin in the game for everyone, right? Because you don't want to penalize physicians, right, for using a lower cost product, but then there has to be benefit to all organizations, right? So it's a business all the way around. So you're right in that it's a little bit tricky and you have to, because of the way the reimbursement's set up, but I think there's a lot more attention being paid to it. And, again, there's this thought about, there was that question about the medical benefit formularies, but there are, some organizations that are preferring some lower cost products. So it's happening now.
Before we turn to utilization management, because I love some of the things you're doing there, so we want to make sure we have time for that. But the last question around this sort of benefit design is these alternative funding programs, and because a lot of manufacturers, obviously, they don't like the fact that these patients are insured, but there's a vendor. You talked about vendors, and the use of vendors are out there saying, "Oh, this drug is no longer non-essential," which is crazy. That they would take these what was essential last year. Now it's not essential when they have a patient who needs it. So help us understand, what is an alternative funding program, and what are the trends there?
Yeah, absolutely. So stated briefly, an alternative funding program is an arrangement where the payer excludes a drug from coverage, and then they work with an outside vendor to help patients obtain financial support for that drug through another source. So you mentioned manufacturer patient programs, foundations. There's a number of different sources. To your point, these are sources that are typically designed for patients who do not have insurance to be able to still access these drugs. So this is kind of a working around in that system. And we've been asking about alternative funding programs for a number of years now. We're not seeing much change year over year. We continue to see fairly low uptake. It's somewhere around 10% overall, 1 in 10 interacting with these programs, a small percentage showing interest. But I think what's even more interesting is every year we ask, how sustainable do you believe these are? And we continue to get the vast majority of our respondents saying, not at all sustainable or very slightly sustainable. So folks are not confident these programs are going to stick around, at least in their current form. And I think that we'll continue to see shifts there. To your point, manufacturers are pushing back and tightening up their programs, and we'll continue to see changes in that space, I think.
We discussed earlier that, sort of price or cost is the, one side of the equation, but the other is utilization management as well. And it was striking to me sort of the mindset around some, the acceptance of sort of aggressive utilization management with sort of gross objectives of just driving down costs. But I'd love to hear you guys unpack that a little bit more. What do you feel is really going on in the world of at these respondents?
I want Renee to take this one. She has some great insights on a couple of specific programs. What I'll say in general about our responses, in terms of use of particular programs, we're not seeing a whole lot of year-over-year change in that space. So, for example, almost everyone is using prior authorization. Some
Right.
of these other strategies are less commonly used. We might talk a little bit about site of care here in a moment as well, if you'd like. Seeing about 1 in 3 plans using site of care, which is interesting, and we have some other findings in that space. But more broadly with you, Renee, do you want to share a little bit of what you've been thinking about lately on that?
I mean, definitely utilization management, especially like prior author step therapy, quantum limits. Those are really important tools, right, in helping to ensure appropriate use. But I would say that most of us would agree that it's not a perfect process, right? I think that the process is broken. So we're starting to see some interest in the industry, and I think this is generated by changes that Optum is putting in place, OptumRx. They're making changes to about 80 drugs. So they're using the initial prior authorization. So that's still in place, but then they're removing the renewal component of it. So that for 6 categories of drugs, like 80 drugs, patients will get indefinite approvals. And so, and I think that they have some good thoughts into why they want to do this because, patients are on lifelong drugs for chronic conditions such as cystic fibrosis or multiple sclerosis. I think it makes sense. You look at cystic fibrosis, there's only a handful of drugs, but no one is switching drugs. There's not really measurable markers outside of the initial PA to make sure you have the right genetic mutation or whatever. But there's not a benefit to a measurable marker, for the renewal period and all that. So that makes sense. But when you look at some of the other categories, we question, are there better ways to improve the process? Because you look at categories like pulmonary arterial hypertension and patients, debilitating disease, right? So people aren't going to get better, but it's just about controlling symptoms or whatever. But the medications could change over time. So you're going to be adding new medications, maybe removing some. There's a lot of combination of products. If you don't have that renewal period, it just adds that extra component to have that extra assessment. Now, the reliance is really on the physician, which is right. But when the physician makes those changes and they're seeing the patients, like who is overseeing that, the patients know which drugs to continue, which ones, to discontinue, which ones to continue. And so, we have concerns about, can we improve the process in other ways so that one, it's not a barrier to access to drugs, but, it's helpful to the patient because I think there is still this gap between, when you see your physician, you get your prescription filled, like who's responsible for helping the patient work through, was I supposed to take that one? Do I still take this other one? To me, that's concerning. The other ways in utilization management that I don't think get recognized enough is that just the cost of drugs. So Stelara being a biosimilar, this is going to help, but it's for Crohn's disease, it's dosed every 8 weeks, but there's, I would say, probably in our experience, more than half the patients are using it once a month. So when you increase that dose, and there might be good reasons why a physician thinks that patient needs, that more frequent use, it's an extra $20,000 for every dose. So for one patient in 1 year, it's an extra $150,000. So you think about that, right? And so while there might be good reasons, like, utilization management could be used as an extra review to say, okay, does every patient need to do this? Or, let's work with the physician to make good decisions. And so it's really, to me, it's not about the prescribing piece of it. It's more about, the patient piece and then like the waste and like, how can you mitigate that, but then have a great member experience. And that's what I think gets lost in all of it is like, how can you improve the process to have a better member experience without losing the value that controlling the utilization properly, has. So
I think I want to applaud you both for including the unintended consequences of utilization management, right? And, one of the things that jumped out for me is just how more and more plans aren't even tracking things like time to therapy, right? Because, that's obviously, we're in Washington, D.C. here. So it's like prior authorization is discussed on Capitol Hill now, right? Like everybody's knows what prior authorization and other things like step therapy and other things are done that are, that I don't want to say they harm all patients, but they certainly harm a lot of patients. And so, and the biggest obviously impact on that is delaying therapy and starting, whether it's oncology, whether you're trying to fight cancer, whether you're, whatever it might be. These are things that are, I think, critically important. So congratulations for tracking that. But how do we get more, I guess, employers, health plans, others
Yeah,
to start
to care.
to start caring about these unintended consequences?
We really promote and support like really understanding what is the purpose you want to achieve with a prior auth, right? So a few years ago, I was at a PBMI. PBMI used to be part of our organization, but we had a conference on specialty drugs, and there was a neurologist that was speaking about the importance of starting patients early on the MS drug therapies and talking a lot about brain volume loss. And it really opened my eyes. And then they also had a patient experience there. And I went back to the plans I was working with and I looked at their PAs for MS and it wasn't accomplishing anything. Like they, those drugs weren't misused or whatever. And one of my clients, I just said, we need to change this. Like we need to remove this PA process, like we have to make it better or whatever. And they were like, who are you? Because, it wasn't something I would be used to, but I think it starts there. Like you want to understand what do you want to accomplish through the PA, but you have to think of the end-to-end process. So from, the beginning and then the patient experience, right? So you don't want to make it longer to get the drug, that type of thing. And so I think, I'm happy we had that question there too, but we have to have more awareness. So we try to bring that awareness to, to the clients that we work with. And then, sometimes they are like, especially patients that have a negative experience. I mean, obviously they're going to hear about it. The PBMs will bring it up, but we help them work through that and think about it, right? And also important to understand if you have a PA and it's getting, the denials are being constantly appealed and the appeals are being overridden, it's important to share that information, right? Because maybe there's something you need to tweak in the PA. Because if it's constantly the denials getting overturned, then it's not apparently having a good purpose, right? So kind of understanding that as well. So we try to ask, and that's a question we have in the survey as well. Like, do you have insight into the number of requests, approvals, denials? I mean, you need to be looking at it and really understand the process there too.
I know we mentioned biosimilars earlier. Anything else to add on the biosimilar topics?
So I would just say that it's a very slow uptake. And to me, it's shocking. The first biosimilar for Humira came to the market in January 2023. And in January of 2025, Humira brand still has 72% of the market share. So, and a lot of that is, driven by the rebates, but it is also important to note, right, that it is the brand still competes against the biosimilars. And so really understanding, where are you getting the savings from and all of that. And so I think that payers are disappointed because they wanted to see more savings up front, right? So they're hoping that the runway for Stelara biosimilars is not as long. And it doesn't appear that it will be, but it's opened a lot of eyes. And it also opens a lot of eyes. There's a lot of competition in that category, right? There's still brand drugs coming to the market. So how do you, again, capitalize on what's going to be, the lowest net cost product, but focus on the clinical effectiveness as well. You have to have a process in place that addresses that too. I think it's really important.
I want to turn to site of care. Again, congratulations on focusing on this because this is where there could be tremendous savings for the plans and employers. So can you explain a little bit more about what you're seeing related to shifting the site of care and whether it's into infusion centers or alternative home-based, just help us understand some of those details in site of care.
Yeah, absolutely. So we've been asking a question in our survey for a number of years. Are you using site of care programs for specialty medications? Asking that broadly. And I'm highlighting that first to say that about 1 in 3 of our respondents, more health plans than employers, indicated that they are using site of care. And they're really tending to favor a mandatory arrangement. So you can have a mandatory arrangement of saying you have to use this site of care for this particular drug. You can have a voluntary arrangement, but maybe provide a patient with incentives for doing so. But we're really seeing a very strong preference among health plans and actually a growing preference among employers to use a mandatory arrangement. And it was interesting too, we're not seeing a lot of change year over year in the overall percentage that are using site of care. But we do see that about half of those that are using site of care are thinking about expanding their site of care programs. So that indicates they may be having some success with the strategy. I do want to add one thing that was new this year that I found really interesting was we actually asked about site of care specifically in oncology. So knowing that not a lot of folks are using site of care in that space right now. In fact, it was 5% of plans in our survey were using site of care in oncology. But we found that among that 95% that weren't, a little over half indicated that they would be willing to consider doing so. So there might be some movement in that space as well toward willingness to actually engage in site of care for oncology patients. So, Renee, what else would you want to share about site of care?
The only thing I would add is I think it's most common to move it kind of out of hospital outpatient more into home infusion. That seems to be the route. And I think there's a lot of experience now, with a lot of the drugs, especially drugs like Remicade, like our, even the Remicade biosimilars, but there's experience, nurses and, providers that are administering that in the home. And I think there's a lack of awareness. That's why the mandatory programs sometimes end up being more successful, because when they're forced to move, then, they realize that, in some cases it can be a much more convenient experience. I even had a personal experience with, someone that I knew that had a teenager that was using Remicade. And when they were forced to move it into the home, they got the same nurse that came. It came on Saturdays, that the teenager was able to play, do their Xbox while they were getting their infusion. So it was a much easier experience rather than, because the prior experience was they were going to a children's hospital, having to take a half a day off of work and school and all of that. So there are some advantages to it. And sometimes it's that awareness that needs to happen that I still think there's, the organizations are thoughtful about what drugs they add. And even in oncology, we are seeing it a little bit. Like I have some clients, but it's not like your most commonly used chemotherapy or anything like that. They're thoughtful about the process. And I think as we're seeing some, simpler dosage forms come with some of the cancer drugs, maybe we'll see more of it. I'm not sure. So
Also, we briefly mentioned earlier cell and gene therapies, but I know there's been a lot of concern from the plans and the sponsors about potential growth in that market. What did you learn from the survey this year?
Yep. So in our survey, we found really high levels of concern about the affordability of cell and gene therapies. Not a surprise there, right? What we did also see, though, kind of matching with that, was a lack of confidence in their understanding of the financial impact of those therapies to their organization, and a lack of confidence in their sort of level of understanding of the pipeline of what's still to come. So there's a lot of this concern, but we're also seeing payers expressing I don't want to say confusion, but a lot of uncertainty about what is going to happen and what this will look like for them. So those were the big themes from our findings this year. We have a little bit as well about what they're financially doing to try to protect themselves with that. But the biggest theme that I would call out is just that uncertainty in this space.
And I would just add that uncertainty is being fueled by just the slower than expected uptake. So I wouldn't at all say that gene therapies are going away, but we're seeing shifts in the market that weren't expected. So, as they develop these, gene therapies for hemophilia, like Pfizer has discontinued their hemophilia B gene therapy Vecfez because they didn't have one patient that sought it. So when you bring drugs like that to the market where their, patients are used to using Factor or other products. I mean, there's other drugs like Hemlibra and other drugs that are really good drugs and they work. And if patients are stable, they aren't going to seek, therapy for the gene therapies. And so we're seeing this little shift that's happening. And then also challenges that when you bring a drug to the market, it's different in the real world than it is right in the clinical trials. And so there's challenges around certifying the treatment centers or, even around the cell collections where they've had to do it twice. And so, in the looking at the sickle cell gene therapies, they had estimated they were going to be able to administer to 100 patients in 2024, and they administered to 8. So now, they're improving processes, but, Bluebird Bio, one of the companies, is being acquired, so there's financial challenges as well. So the market's a little bit different. If you look at other drugs, though, like Elevidys, that's for Duchenne muscular dystrophy, there were 342 administrations in 2024. So, that was pretty significant. Zolgensma had 250. So the drugs are being used, but the tsunami of, the drugs coming to the market and the uptake of them didn't pan out, I think, as expected. So it's just a little bit more like timed out distribution now. So I think, payers should still be concerned and, really look at being able to predict if they have any patients that might be candidates for these drugs so they can make the right financial decisions. But other than that, it's a little bit slower uptake than what we were originally expecting.
Just a quick follow-up on that. I noticed on one of the questions, I think there was an indication that some of the plan sponsors were not covering cell and gene therapy. And I just wondered what that meant. What's behind that? Is that like categorical statements, like Mark was saying earlier, we're just going to declare these medicines not essential? Or is that more like lasering individual patients and how, what's going on with that? Or is it something else? Is it, just, uncertainty?
I would say it's more around the way that, like, and it's mostly Elevidys that is driving this, and the drugs that are getting like accelerated approval, because those drugs are they don't have like final proof that they actually work, right? But they're meeting an unmet need in the market because these patients don't have drugs that effectively treat these conditions, right? So it's kind of a difficult situation, but we are seeing more plans not cover drugs that are, being approved through accelerated approval, because, they want that full approval and, like proof that the actual drugs have benefits, not have toxicities, things like that. So I think it's more around that. I don't think it's necessarily lasering out patients. I don't think that, the thought is, oh, they're expensive, we don't want to cover it. But we've had a lot of questions like, is this a must cover drug? And that's when you have to look at, like, in hemophilia, there are drugs that are effectively treating these patients, right? So in those situations, I've had a couple of clients that didn't cover Roctavian or Becfez, for those reasons, because they didn't feel that, it was kind of true what happened in the market, right? So it's a mix out there, but there's definitely an awareness, and the plan sponsors are smart and they want to understand more about the drug, and they don't want to spend millions of dollars on a drug that may not be effective or that hasn't proven to be effective. That's kind of the conundrum, in my opinion.
Thanks.
Well, that brings us to our final question. We ask all of our guests, what is their prescription for better access? But for the two of you, we're going to modify that a little bit, if that's okay, and ask you, if you were designing a next generation specialty drug benefit, what key principles would you build in to better balance cost control, patient access, as well as innovation?
The two things that come to mind immediately for me are transparency and then also integration of information, so that the true cost of medications and then their impact on clinical outcomes for patients can be more clear and payers can make more informed decisions. So those are the couple of principles, if I was thinking about designing an optimal benefit, that would be really impactful, I believe.
I would design something that's not a one size fits all. I agree with the greater transparency and greater integration of information, but I believe in using data to kind of drive the strategies and to be, to know what your trend drivers are, what your pain points are, and really focus on appropriate use, right? So making sure that the right patient gets the right drug at the right diagnosis, the right dose, frequency, and duration. There's a lot to be said when, you have those controls in place and be able to manage costs, at the end of the day. So
Excellent. And with that, we wrap up our 29. Now we're almost out of our 20s here, Scott. So we're going to be moving into our 30s.
Thanks to our guests for joining us and doing so for a repeat follow-up episode. It's really fun to get a cheap, especially, on something where you have some great data and it's fresh from the market, combined with some insights from people who are working in the markets and all those kinds of things. So it's always fun to talk with folks that, are bringing that to the table. Overall, Mark, I think I was impressed that there's not a lot of movement and overall and kind of what people are thinking and doing. And it just makes me feel even more that we continue to be locked into this high list price, high rebate, high intensity, management, high friction, system that, we can't seem to come up with a replacement for it, but so many folks are kind of unhappy with, nonetheless. And so anyway, there's a real paradox around that. And then the other thing I'll just add is, I do worry, Renee's comments there at the end, I understand it, but I do worry about, plans and plan sponsors choosing not to cover medicines that have accelerated approval, or maybe have FDA approval, but have some other older standard of care that they judge to be sort of good enough. And again, I understand it, but at the same time, it just feels like a disconnect. When the regulatory bodies and the doctors and patients are saying, we need new, we need innovative, we need better, and we want that faster, and yet our ability, our payment mechanism for that is, not recognizing that. And so I don't know how to reconcile it, but I think it's like a canary in the coal mine. But there may be more problems ahead.
Well, I totally agree with all your points. And again, like on rebates, it's like they're hooked on a drug that they just can't get off, and we need to bring in some Narcan or something to get them off of it. But I was also, another trend that I didn't realize until today was how many different aspects of this is now being broken up into different vendors, right? And more vendors are getting involved to sort of provide sort of ancillary capabilities to sort of supplement it. And I guess one of those, of course, is the alternative funding programs, which, we've had episodes on, and good to hear that one's at least stable and they realize it's not sustainable. And I really, as I said, I applaud them for tracking the unintended consequences, because that's what you and I hear, right? We talk to people, whether it was the provider groups that we interviewed, whether it was, others that you interview, where the patients that we've interviewed on the show, where they talk about, what happened to them and what the challenges were for them. And these things are, again, creating these unintended consequences, including delayed time to treatment, which is really the ultimate problem when it's your cancer or your spouse's cancer or your child's cancer, right? So, these are the things that I'm thrilled that they're tracking it and doing their chance to increase the visibility of that. And so for me, I think for us, I think that's the theme, which is, we know there's this challenge with costs. We know there's this war of all against all. And I just have to say that it's efforts like this to track the data, look at it year after year, and really, again, thanks to Genentech for sponsoring this, thanks to PSG for doing this, that allows us to see this and hopefully then put in place programs and efforts to try to make things better going forward. And with that, we come to the end of episode 29. Again, Morgan, thank you. I know you both are doing a wonderful job, but thank you for doing this report year after year. Please keep us in touch for other studies that you're doing. Renee, thank you for what you're doing to be on the front lines of solving these challenges and working with your clients. We're thrilled that you're our first return guest, and hopefully we can do this every year. So with that, thank you to Scott Howe, my partner, and with that, we wrap up episode 29. And thank you for all the listeners. And if you have any questions or comments, you can always reach us at comments@prescriptionforbetteraccess.com. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks.